All right, guys. Welcome to Note to File Live. I'm going to go ahead and add our guest here, Raymond Nomizu. CRIO, thanks so much for coming on, man. I know you're at Scope, so I really appreciate you, taking some time out to come talk to us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for hosting me, Brad. Big fan of your podcast.
No, absolutely. How's the vibe at Scope, man? I've been watching a little bit from virtually, and been some pretty cool panels so far. I caught the patient engagement awards, I believe, is what they were called last night.
A lot of energy, a lot of people coming by. It's great. I love it. It's nice. I admit I don't go to as many sessions as I want because I'm out in the booth and talking to people and
sure, you got to be out there, and man, you're there to schmooze, right? You gotta talk and network, and that's the appeal of being there. It's definitely not as much fun watching it as it is attending those things. So fair enough. Well, very cool, man. I just want to kind of jump right in. We've talked a little bit sort of offline about, EHR, EDC, eSource. I think it's becoming a sort of really interesting point of intersection and I guess non-intersection sort of between these three.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I kind of want to open with, right off the bat, something I've been noticing, and we talked about too offline, is the use of EMR in clinical trials. And sort of, I've been shocked to learn how more common that is than what I anticipated, coming from someone who does not use EMR as source or record any research visits there. So, I mean, talk to us a little bit about that. I know you've worked on and have some even data and maybe input on, how sites are using that.
Yeah, we do. Obviously, it's been something that we've been studying very carefully. I mean, for those who don't know CRIO, we are an eSource company, and so our business essentially predicated on the idea that sites aren't actually using the EMR, and a significant number of sites are not, like yourself, Brad, and a lot of sites have essentially made the choice that the EMR is not the most suitable software system in which to record the clinical data for a clinical trial. And there are some sites that have, and so I can definitely speak to that. So I just go right into the data, and then let me sort of give you my thoughts as to why we're observing this phenomenon. So we did a survey. We did it of the ACRP membership, which, as you know, is a great cross-section of different types of sites, where you got the academic centers, the hospitals, the freestanding sites, and it's a huge membership. So we got over 100 responses, and we asked the sites if they use EHR and how do you use it. And we had different use cases. Okay, and so of the respondents, 74% use the EHR to identify and recruit patients, right? So as the feasibility, right, and also to find patients, 74%. So that means 3/4 of the research sites out there are using an EMR in that capacity. And that would suggest that there's about 1/4 that are not using the EMR. And that makes sense because there is a business model where you have research sites that don't actually provide care. So they don't have access to the EMR, right? And so I've heard 25% anecdotally, but this very much aligns with it. 74% use the EMR for scheduling patients, right? Because they need to get on the doctor's calendar because the doctor's doing care. And that's the busy one, right? So you got to book it on the doctor's calendar. So scheduling. 67% use it as an informational source for clinical data. So that's how we worded it. We are using this as an informational source. In other words, I'm getting the medical records from the EMR, and those medical records are informing, right, the data that we do record for the clinical trial, because that has the history of the diagnoses and the medications and all of that, right? I will then take that, and that won't be the only source. I will then combine it with other sources, such as the interview of the patient and the physical exam and all the other procedures that are part of the trial, right? So it's part of the informational inputs. And then we ask how many of you are actually using it to record original source data for a clinical trial. And we have to break out the answers by type of site. So if it's a oncology or surgery site, most are, about 60% are using the EMR as the source data. If it's not oncology or surgery, only 25% are. And then we asked another question, said, okay, for those of you who say that you are actually recording source data in the EMR, do you have paper? Do you supplement or complement it with paper? Are there paper charts? And 20 of the 25 said yes. So even though there is use of EMR, it's obviously not perfect. And obviously the sites are finding that they have to complement it with use of paper in their workflows. And so I think if you say, like, why is this happening? I mean, clearly sites have access to the EMR, right? The data shows that. They're choosing not to. And I think it's because, just EMR and healthcare and research, I mean, they both involve patients, but they're very different workflows. I mean, you wouldn't expect a banking company and an insurance company to use the same software because they both involve money, right? So what is the purpose of each system, right? So an EMR is in the context of delivery of healthcare. So it really uses high volume, almost lowest common denominator source templates, right? So the visit or the encounter is what they call it in research. In care, we'll have like very simple kind of basic structured fields, right? A lot of emphasis on ICD-10 codes. It's not a research concept. That's a healthcare concept, right? They won't have a place for adverse events. Adverse events doesn't exist in the care concept, care world, right? An adverse event is only a research-specific concept, and in the care world, there'll just be a diagnosis, right, or a problem or a symptom or something. But in research, adverse event is very time-specific. It's contextual to the time, right? So the templates in care just do not work for research, right? The care templates are simple, minimalistic, designed for billing and designed for high velocity. And then when the EMR data is recorded, right, what happens? It generates a bill to the insurance companies, which you can't do with research, right? So the way to think about an eSource system is basically it's like an EMR in the sense that it allows the site to collect data, but it's going to be much more configurable. The templates will be much more customized to the needs of that study because the study data is extremely rigorous in terms of how the protocol specifies the methodology for collecting data, right? So it's going to have different workflows in an eSource system. So, but if you're running a trial as a research site, scheduling is not scheduling. Scheduling has to be done with a window, right? Very basic concept. An EMR system might not have that kind of window configuration specific to this instance of a patient in this particular context. You're going to need a lot more configuration. You're going to need adverse events as a data construct, right? In an eSource system. So, and then of course, at the end, you're not billing insurance, you're billing pharma, right? So there has to be this concept of being able to support study-specific budgets, right, that are tied to the data collection. So at the end of the trial, or during the trial, the site knows how much they're getting paid or how much is due to them from pharma. And that's a very different sort of billing arrangement and financial construct than what's in the care world, right? I don't think they have holdbacks, for instance, and
right.
Other workflows that don't apply, like prior auth and all this other stuff, right? That a clinical research system wouldn't concern itself with. So it's very different workflow context, and I think that explains the data that we're seeing.
Yeah, and then anecdotally, that makes perfect sense to me. Also as an aside, anybody out there listening, feel free to jump in the comments. We'd love to engage and answer questions. Again, I made a poll about this several months ago, and I was kind of surprised to hear how many sites did utilize EMR. Maybe I phrased the question poorly, but if you're out there,
source or for patient recruiting, right?
Well, I think for source, which again was very shocking because, like you mentioned, it makes a lot of sense on the front end because you've got to start somewhere, right? As a site. Now, a lot of this doesn't even account for the really diversifying site models that exist. We work with a bunch of different practices who are all using different EMRs.
Right.
We can't be in 10 different EMR systems, know how to use them correctly, but it's a great place to start in order to farm that data for, eligibility or just, again, get a starting point. But an observation I've made too is that a lot of EMR data simply is not reliable.
Correct.
The more we dig, the more we realize we're having to correct data that we collected from the EMR upon interviewing a patient. So, that is obviously a gigantic pain. And if you were to use that as your source, well, then you've got to also create a whole nother workflow for editing and creating addendum for all these notes, which again, most, especially third-party research companies, that are emerging are not necessarily in a good position to do. So right off the bat, it occurred to me that it's just not a great model. I'm more surprised to hear that the ones that do, it sounds like an overwhelming majority still use paper to supplement that source. So it's sort of, what are we doing?
Yeah. And you touched upon something else. So I think it's important people understand, your model, your operating model, because a lot of physicians and will engage as principal investigators. So you have a lot of practices, maybe community physician groups that do research, but a lot of times when you actually look at how it's being done is oftentimes through a partnership, right? So you've got a separate company, right? And so there's going to be a release to your company for research, and you've got some kind of arrangement, right, with the practice, right? And they have the patients and the medical expertise, and you've got the clinical trial expertise, right? It's very hard for your average doctor to do research. It's just a completely different world. It's hard to go and get studies, hard to negotiate. So like how would a doctor normally have time, right? So that's your model, right? But you're now a third party, and it sounds to me like you have a number of practices that you partner with, right? And so from your perspective, like you said, even if the EMR system had the right workflows, even if it had the accurate data, what is my challenge in terms of working with one system that allows me to standardize and centralize, right? Because from your perspective, your team, I'm assuming they're on the hook for quality, right? And so if you could log into a system and actually see the quality, you can provide the oversight that you want to, but you can't really do that with EMR systems because of all the, like all the privacy and HIPAA concerns and all of that.
Yeah, you really do. And, this comment kind of points out, I mean, you're like reinventing the wheel with every different EMR system that you have to work within. And again, we're big. We're not big. We're very small. We don't have the resources to train every coordinator with every level of access. Sometimes just getting the access to even do some of these things is a nightmare. The bigger the system, right? So yeah, to me, if you're an academic medical center, you've got your own in-house research, then maybe there's a world where that makes more sense. But I do feel like, for what's truly emerging, which is more community partnerships, more third parties, partnering, it just doesn't make any sense really to try to integrate to that degree.
Yeah. So I'm seeing some comments about the difficulty mapping HRD. Absolutely 100% that's true. Although I do want to make a more foundational point, which is that sites aren't even using the EMR for data collection. So there's nothing to really integrate with. Like if you integrate with the EMR, you wouldn't actually see the data for the trial for a lot of sites because they're simply not populating the EMR, right? So EMR to EDC might work for the sites that do actually populate the EMR, the 25% in our survey, but it won't work for the 75%. Like there is no data to integrate with. So forget about the technical challenges, which is enormous. There's actually, most data is not actually in the EMR. And you touched on another point, Brad, which is the data in the EMR is not accurate. And we actually did a study on that. We did a study, we solicited from sites, anonymized patient data. We said, okay, you've done some trials. You have the medical history and the ConMeds, right, that were entered into the EDC for the trial. You have the medical records, right? You obtained it prior to randomization, right? And, just sanitize them, send it to us. We had a couple pairs of clinically trained nurses, third party, review them and actually compare the medical history to the problem list. I think it's called problem list, right? The problem list in the EMR to the medical history in our case, eSource, but you could say EDC, right? And there were major discrepancies. The vast majority, over 90%, had a discrepancy. So I'll just read the data. So let's just take medical history. So on average, okay, the average number of problems in a given patient's medical chart was 7.0. Of the 7.0, 4.8 made it into the EDC, 2.2 did not. So that means they had some couple of diagnoses that the PI said, you know what, you don't actually have this. Like if I entered that into the EDC, I'm giving you inaccurate data, right?
Yeah, and again, we see that all the time when we reconcile the records when we're talking to patients, and it's just shocking the things you come across. I never took that medication. Yeah, the doctor prescribed it. I never picked it up. If you were to use that as your source of data, you'd be wrong.
You have serious problems, right? And then conversely, we said, okay, what's in the EDC? And is it in the EMR? And we found 3.6 diagnoses, like problems, medical history items, records per patient that were not in the EMR. So maybe there was another medical record they had, maybe a different network, or maybe the PI said, you actually do have these, and the EMR didn't actually diagnose you properly, right? In fact, there are entire clinical trials where the basis of the indication oftentimes is misdiagnosed. So you have companies that basically specialize in saying to the pharma companies and the academic hospitals, saying, look, we can mine millions and millions of patient lives and use artificial intelligence to augment the readability of the EMR to find candidates that we think might actually have the indication that you're looking for. Because if it had a one-to-one match with the ICD-10 code, we wouldn't need all this AI, right? So like the very fact that you have companies whose value proposition is to go beyond the structured data set in the EMR to find people that meet the eligibility, even for the basic condition of the trial, tells you that the medical record is not accurate. It's simply not. And so, and you say, okay, why is that the case, right? It ought to be, right? Like you hope the health system is accurate, but think about what care is, right? Here's a big difference between care and research, right? So you got to think of care or the health system or the EMR as like being a wiki. There are multiple authors, right? You go to a health system, you get one provider, different provider, different provider. Every single provider just throws something in there, right? So who owns the source of truth? Like who is actually accountable? Like, is there a single person in the health system who's liable for the accuracy and completeness of those records, right? No. On the research triangle, who is? One doctor, right? Like
right.
When you sign that 1572 as a PI, you're responsible.
You're on the hook.
Yeah, exactly. So you have this idea of accountability to a single individual on a research trial. So that PI is going to be very methodical, very rigorous, and will do the reconciliation and cleanup, which, by the way, is one of the reasons why research takes longer, right? The visits take longer. It's much more methodical, right? It's like, it's not 15 minutes in and out, which is what the care system is based on. It's, 2 hours, 3 hours at a time, very meticulous data collections. So there are some serious accuracy issues around the EMR.
Yeah, well, look, you're preaching to the choir. I mean, I've always been under the impression that EMR is not really well suited for capturing research data. But what about take the question here? What about direct EDC or eCRF entry? And so, I've read through the FDA guidance on this, and it appears to, sort of make or imply that would be okay. Now that raises other problems, but why don't we see more direct data entry into EDC?
Yeah, it probably is okay from a regulatory perspective, although I'm not really sure if that view would be shared by all regulators around the world. I do know that in Europe, for instance, there are definitely regulators who would have the view that the site needs to have direct ownership and control of their records.
Right.
And so the idea of there being a unitary database given to the sites would maybe have a harder time in Europe. I'm not sure what the FDA's view is, but what you describe as CRIO, right? Like that's a system provided by the sponsor and it's clinical scales that are entered directly. So here's how I think about the EDC system, right? And here's how I think about an eSource system. I actually think they have two different value propositions. So the EDC really is about the endpoint data, right? Like, why are we doing this trial? We're doing this trial to collect AEs, right? To collect, basically the efficacy and safety endpoint data. The protocols say that, right? And the eCRF is really written for the site to go in retrospectively and enter the endpoint data. Most EDC systems aren't really designed for the full workflow required for a site to collect data accuracy. So the way I would think about eSource, is that the eSource is actually starts with the protocol, not the endpoint data. So when you're designing eCRF, the eCRF designer will say, okay, data management, give me the endpoints. Like, what do you really need to run this trial, right? And so that's the spec for the eCRF. Think about eSource. What's the spec? It's a protocol. Why? Because the sites have to collect the data per protocol. So the sites need to not just collect systolic and diastolic, but they should also be documenting that it was collected as prescribed in the protocol. And I've never seen a protocol that didn't tell you how the blood pressure should be collected, like what arm, what position, how long, right?
Yeah.
So every site will tell you exactly, hey, I'm not just recording systolic and diastolic, I'm recording what time they sat, what position, which arm, and then sometimes they get complicated. It's like dominant arm, non-dominant arm, like what, do two arms and figure out that. Like, it gets really complicated, right? Extremely specific. And you don't really see that in the eCRF. It's mostly about get the blood pressure. And so I think with an eSource system, it's going to be much more comprehensive than you see. Like at your site, Brad, like if you look at the source that's being completed by the coordinator team, it is actually a broader data set than what goes into eCRF, right?
That is true.
And it's this much that goes into the eCRF, right? So really, as a sponsor, you really do need access to this broader data set, because you don't just need the endpoint data the statistician is going to use. You need to know that it was collected per protocol. So you really do need to know that the site's collecting, because if you don't know the site's collecting, that the endpoint data in the ECRF is actually collected per protocol, you haven't eliminated confounding factors, right? Like, just imagine if 50 sites collected blood pressure differently and they'll enter systolic diastolic, and then you'd be drawing conclusions as a sponsor around the longitudinal impact of the drug on the blood pressure, right? But with Source, you would be documenting everything, and that's how you know that they're comparable, right? Because you designed the protocol that way. And then the other value of direct data entry isn't simply the inefficiency. It's simply removing the inefficiency of transcription, but it's also bringing the edit checks at the point of data capture, right? It's not going to help the site if there's an edit check in the ECRF when the patient's gone, a lot of times, right?
Yeah.
It's very helpful to the site to see the edit checks at the point of capture. So what a good eSource system can do is it can basically eliminate protocol deviations, right? I think that is the sole purpose. I mean, that is the core value proposition, right? So a site director, Brad, I'm sure you appreciate, right? You don't want deviations at your site, right? Like, it's
no, ideally not. And I mean, something you point out that does happen, with, I wouldn't say fairly regularly, but it's not uncommon that somebody walks out the door, you go to enter data that you wrote down on paper only to realize, well, crap, I forgot something, or this is not, fully complete, whatever the reason is, that,
right.
eSource can have some logic
Exactly.
built into it that, can give you those, that red flag before a patient walks out the door when you complete a visit.
Exactly. So that's the power of the eSource. It captures errors and prevents errors from happening. And from a site perspective, I'm sure you end up saving time if you have fewer of those, because every missed data point, like, might have to bring the patient back in, right?
Yeah, or track them down on the phone. I mean, whatever it is, it's at least some extra interaction that everybody's got to deal with.
Yeah, it's time. It's time on your part for the site, and as a site owner, you don't exactly have a lot of time, right? You don't have a large staff sitting around with nothing to do, right? It's hard to find coordinators as it is, right? So labor is, especially clinical labor, like people who actually know how to run trials, they're in short demand.
Sure.
So, right? No, high demand, short supply. And so anything that you can do to save time means that you can now have the coordinating team do more visits, right? More time focused on recruitment, more focused on retention, as opposed to cleaning up this mess, right? And by the way, the CRAs have more work too, right? Like, the CRAs are the ones who have to flag it. They have to do the follow-up to make sure it's done, right? So it's work on extra on both sides. So to me, the real value prop of an eSource system is that I think of it as an e-protocol. If a site receives the e-protocol, right, and they're collecting data the way the e-protocol was designed, they're collecting it the way you intended to, right? So if you think about this from a manufacturing perspective. Let's just say you had some designs and they were in a blueprint, right? Like, and they were a PDF blueprint, right? Very elaborate. And you send them off to 50 manufacturing plants. And there's like a machine, right? And every plant has to read those blueprints and then configure the machine. Maybe they got it right, maybe they got it wrong. They're all configuring it slightly differently. Maybe they're interpreting it differently. Maybe you wrote the protocol thinking this is the right way to do it. Two people read it and they have two different interpretations, right? And then things come off of the manufacturing line. Well, that's not good. You don't have quality control. You don't have standardization, right? And the only way you know if those machines were configured right is you send a human being on there to go and look at the sampling on the lot, right? Now imagine if you could take the blueprints and send it electronically and all the machines get automatically configured, right? Then you have a high degree of confidence that what comes out of that machine is the way you designed it, right? The e-protocol is the missing ingredient in today's clinical trial industry, right? Because that's the one piece where there is slippage and variation where there shouldn't be.
That begs a question because, to me, anyways, as it stands, overwhelmingly, and I'm trying to even think of any exceptions, but the source is sort of the problem of the site, right? So as it stands, it is that, I feel like sites are being put in a position to say, here it is, here's a bunch of stuff.
They have to design it.
Figure it out. You figure out how it all goes in. Here's some like weird coding for ECRFs in the background with like some, you'll figure it out. Just go ahead. So should there be a shift towards, sponsors or someone providing that could create some consistency or standardization? Like, why don't we see that?
Yes, there should be. I think there should be, right? I mean, in clinical research, variation is not your friend, right? You don't want variation. That's the whole point. You want everything collected a certain way. I mean, that's why the protocol is written the same, written with that kind of rigor, right? So you want standardization. So if you had patient ePro diaries now, it's all standardized, right? You know exactly what you're asking, exactly what the data means when you get it back. And we don't have that on the site side. And the burden of creation of the template and the interpretation of the protocol into the workflow tool and the data capture mechanism, that's left up to the individual sites. And I know sometimes the sites will share their version of the template to the CRA to look at, which also isn't that great because now you have 50 different templates being shared with 10 different CRAs who may themselves not all be on the same page, right? Who really understands the protocol? People that wrote it, right? It's a sponsor's protocol. It's their compound. It's their scientific trial, right? I can't imagine how much thought and attention went into writing a protocol. It's a lot, right? I can barely read one.
Right.
So clearly somebody put a lot of attention to it. So if you're going to take that kind of ownership into designing a trial very carefully to test your compound so you get the data that you want, so you can draw conclusions from a scientific perspective, you ought to take the time to standardize the way that data is being collected.
Yeah. And that makes sense to me. I've heard this before too, that creating source is how, study coordinators learn the protocol. Look, maybe this is says more about me, but I'd rather be able to just follow the steps. They're already there. I mean, that's how I would learn the protocol, is by having 100% confidence that these are the steps I need in order to undertake these study visits and to, walk our patient through that journey. You're not wrong. It is a great way for coordinators to learn. Unfortunately, the way I often learn is because I have to change my source after every visit because, something was overlooked or just wasn't made, all that clear, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, we have technology for a reason. Like, I don't know how to make bread, but I don't want to go and learn how to make bread. I just want to get the bread, right? So sites just have limited bandwidth, right? And I think at the end of the day, it'd be more important for the sponsor to know they're getting reliable data than to know that people are really, like, it doesn't really matter how deep the understanding of the protocol is. They just need to know that they're getting the data the way they designed it, right? I mean, that is the, like, the core mission of what a protocol is all about.
Yeah, no, I would tend to agree. And again, I think, even statements like, what steps are different for each site. And I can respect that.
Yeah.
This is something I've started to change, and this is probably heresy coming from somebody who's such a sort of site advocate. But I mean, to some degree, like, as sites, we need to be okay with some level of standardization. We don't all have to do everything our own way for every little thing. And I still struggle with that a lot. And I mean, I think the idea was, wouldn't it be better if the steps weren't different for each site so that there is a little more scientific rigor and consistency, less variables? I mean, I feel like we would end up having better data at the end of the day, right? With the less variation there is. And I know, again, sites historically have sort of fought against that, even myself. But some things I think we need to be willing to, sort of get in line on together so that, it'll be better for all of us. And ultimately, I think better for the data that is, taken from that.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I ran a site. I understand it. I get it. And I know that a lot of sites may have a specific way they like to write the source, a specific, template that they like to use. And I know a lot of sites take a lot of pride in their templates. I mean, rightfully so. It's a lot of work to do it. And good quality templates are a reflection of good thought and preparation. But at the end of the day, if you're a sponsor, why would the quality of your data hinge on the individual skill of the 50 to 100 sites, that are on the trial? It's hard enough to find patients, right? So at the end of the day, if you're a sponsor, you need patients, and so you're going to go where the patients are, and that may mean it goes through the pathway of a site that doesn't have that level of sophistication. So why wouldn't you just take the approach saying, okay, there is a skill, right, to writing source templates, rigorously and with enough detail and lack of ambiguity that makes it so it's very reliable representation of the protocol. There's a skill to that, right? So why not develop that skill and then standardize around that across all the sites. So you're not beholden to one particular site. And I'm not sure. I'm certain that, like, if I put myself in the shoes of a CRO, I'm certain if I came to a site and I saw good quality templates, I'd be very ecstatic. I'd be very happy. I'd say, you know, I'm very confident. I know right off the bat you're a good site, right? But at the end of the day, if you're the sponsor, I'm pretty sure they don't actually see or measure sites by their source template design. I'm pretty sure they, what do they see, right? Enrollment, EDC entry time, and data queries, because that's what I can measure, right? And make protocol deviations, right? Like, there are certain quantitative metrics that we know the sponsors can track quantitatively because it's meaningful and it's meaningful to them, right? And so it's so disconnected, the quality of the source template the site writes, to, in terms of, like, you know, I'm looking at the EDC anyway, right? So it all comes into the EDC. Like, I'm not actually using your source, right? So,
well, well, maybe I have another question
yeah,
to going into that realm. First, I do want to point out, I know there's questions here that are perfectly valid from
yeah,
sites, or what seem like they're from sites, in terms of, yeah, you know, sites shouldn't be told what to do. Fine. If you want to do things your own way, I understand. And I'm very sensitive to the fact that sites operate very differently. We work with different doctors, different clinics. I understand. Ultimately, I still feel like the data is data. There's you know, there's only a certain level of variation there. I do believe with, and agree with Jonathan here, I think there's certainly a place where you can allow for customization while still ensuring that the core data is collected. I don't think those two things have to be at odds with one another. So I don't mean to necessarily go too far to the extreme to say every site needs to do everything the same way. That's obviously crazy. And I think part of what makes a successful site is recognizing how a site needs to adapt and work differently than another one. So please don't quote me too hard, guys, on
that I agree with.
Saying that.
That I agree with. I think there's a happy medium here where, from a sponsor's perspective, I know how I want the data collected, right? So I can represent that workflow faithfully and I can standardize. And there probably is not a great argument for a site to say, no, that's the wrong workflow, right? Like, if you want the data collected a certain way, there's just a certain workflow that comes out of that, right? There's not a lot of room for interpretation, but there are a lot of reasons why sites may have additional workflows that are unique to that site. Maybe they have a CAPA, or maybe they have a COVID test procedure. Classic examples, some sites have pre-screening visits that are sort of part of the study, but it's their visit. But and some sites don't. They go right to the screening visit, right? So there are going to be some differences. So the optimal solution, honestly, is sort of like a core workflow solution from the sponsor perspective, gets the data per protocol, but has a room for individual site customization on top of that. So it becomes a lot more collaborative, right? And the sites can sort of embed their own procedural compliance into that template. And that's a little bit different than like an ePro, right? Where patients really shouldn't be giving you an opinion as to additional data points, right? Because they don't do this for a living.
Fair. Well, and you know, something I do want to touch back on is, what about a future where there is no EDC from a site perspective, right? I mean, if sites are using eSource, or maybe there's a world where there's some standard by which eSource pulls. It doesn't mean that everyone's using the same form necessarily, but there's some standard that's pulling from.
Yeah.
And the sponsor can pull that data directly from, you know, input eSource. Do we, as sites, do we care about an EDC? I mean, we don't really, right? I mean, we just care about the data that we're collecting, and then the sponsor can make a pull and do whatever they do with that data, which is, you know, magic, I assume.
100% agree with you. Yeah. So, you know, at the end of the day, you don't need an EDC to run a trial. Like, that is, I mean, when was ICH? I should know this from GCP training, but 1940 something ICH. Like, there was no EDC concept right then. There was no, that didn't exist, right? So clearly EDC is not, you know, a fundamental concept to research, right? What is a fundamental concept to research, right? Endpoint data that's collected per protocol, reliable endpoint data. That's what sponsors need, right? So if you had a system where you had reliable endpoint data housed in that system, it was original, contemporaneous, right? Alcoa, and collected in a manner that was per protocol because it was programmed that way per the workflows, right? Then that is the data that sponsors need. So the question is, how do I get a hold of that data, right? And I understand. So yes. So if you can move the data to the point of capture at the site level, that's the data that you want. taking that data out and putting it into another EDC system, that's like, I have clean laundry. Am I going to hire a laundry service to come and clean it again, right? If anything, it might get dirty again. So if there's a way to move to a direct data capture model, right, then that makes a lot of sense for the industry, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I would think so too. I just again, it seems so crazy when you really stand back and look that you're pulling some things from EMR, you're writing some things on paper, you're taking all that stuff, and then you're typing it into a whole nother system for someone to look at. And those, a lot of times, again, like Doug pointed out, yeah, there's data checks in the EDC, but if you're not doing it contemporaneously at the time of the visit, what doesn't do you any good, so I feel like, again, we're just creating so many problems.
There is.
It's crazy.
Yeah, and there's also another inefficiencies. So maybe as a site, this will resonate, and you're seeing it from the site's perspective. But there, when the monitors show up at your site and they look at source data, right? They are flagging it if they see something wrong with the data. They see that the data is not accurate, not consistent, not signed, not attributable. They're looking for outcode, right? And they're also doing the source data verification to make sure that the data is faithfully representing the EDC. So they're actually doing two things, right? In the clinical world, is called the SDR, source data review, and source data verification, right? They're not just doing source data verification, right? They are doing source data review, and they have to do source data review because the CRA's, the ClinOps team, is responsible for protocol compliance, site training, patient safety, right? That's all in the purview of what ClinOps does. And they can't exercise that kind of oversight unless they're looking at source. They have to look at source. So source data review is just a fancy way of saying you're looking at the source. Okay, so I'm looking at the source already. Then I'm confirming that the source actually matches the EDC, right? Then data management comes in, and they don't look at the source. They're looking in the EDC. So they pop in, the data shows up in the EDC system for the first time. So what do? Is it accurate? Is it consistent? Was it done? As a site, do you ever get like a query from data management that you've already resolved?
Of course.
So the CRA is saying, hey, there's something weird about this data. Can you explain to me? And then, I don't know, maybe you do it verbally while they're on site.
Sometimes, yeah.
Yeah, might do it verbally, and then they're happy, and they say, okay, this is clean. And then a week later, you get the exact same query from data management, right? Right. So, I mean, let's just so I think people really need to understand, what's happening here. Okay, let's take a really simple procedure, like BMI, right? Height, weight, BMI. Okay, very simple, right? So the CRA comes and they look at source, and they're saying, okay, did Brad's site collect height? Did they collect weight? Is the BMI accurate? And is it exclusionary, right? Pretty straightforward. And did the person who collected was per DOA, right? So basics. Then they're saying, okay, is the height on the piece of paper or whatever in source the same as the height in the EDC? Yes or no? Is the weight the same? Yes or no? Right? They do that little SDV check mark in the EDC. Okay? Then data management comes and says, oh, here's height and weight. Was height collected? Was weight collected? Yes or no? And then they do their review. That is literally what is going on. So there are three workflows going on at the sponsor level: SDR, source data review, SDV, and DM review. And DM review is very similar to what DM review, I would actually argue, is a subset of what SDR is, right? There really isn't a lot of queries coming from DM, I think, that if you had a good CRA on site, a good CRA would capture that, right? I mean, how often does data management say, oh, this is, I caught something that the CRA didn't, right? Maybe it's a second.
Yeah, generally not too common. It seems like, though, when it does happen, it's usually a very back and forth. One person says one thing, another says another, and those things take time to resolve. But thankfully, they do seem to be fairly uncommon.
Okay, well, yeah, that's good. That's good. So, yeah, a lot of inefficiencies are baked into this process.
Yeah. That's again, there's some questions here. There's some good conversation in the chat, and I have to admit I have a really hard time reading the comments and trying to pay attention at the same time. So probably doing a poor job of each. There seems to be some, talk about, I guess, the appropriateness of what would get pulled over into EDC. I mean, yeah. Look, a lot of that, to me, I don't see, it's not different than writing a progress note in your source that never goes into the EDC. There's no reason eSource can account for that, right?
So there is a point here in the thread that is valid, which is, at the end of the day, the statistician needs structured data, right? They need the endpoint data. They're going to run their analysis that determines safety or efficacy, right? The statistician does not want, need, or is positioned to interpret progress notes or some of the other data that goes into source, right? So there is a concept that in source, there's just a lot of data. And part of the endpoint data is going through an interpretation process by the PI, right? Like the PI has to say, is this clinically significant or not? You have to say, is this event an AE or not? Is it, like there's certain judgment that's baked into the process. I mean, that's why you hire PIs, because they have to be qualified. It's not a job off the street. You have to be medically trained. You have to know what you're doing, right? So you're paying for the PI for the PI's clinical judgment, and source will contain a lot of documentation surrounding that. So I get the point. At the end of the day, a statistician is not equipped to deal with it. But I don't think that's right to insulate the sponsor from visibility into those, right? Because at the end of the day, who's responsible ultimately for the quality of the data? The sponsor. Who's responsible for ensuring that the PIs are interpreting it correctly? The PI is exercising oversight. The patient safety is protected, right? Like the sponsor needs to know that, right? So, and most CRAs are trained, right? ClinOps, they're the group that is clinically trained. They should be trained to have some level of interpretation. They have medical monitors, right? Like if it's a really hard problem, like they can go to the medical monitor, right? And they do bring in medical monitors, right? So that capability already exists, okay? The capability to interpret that more complex, nuanced data does not exist right now, quite honestly, in data management EDC. They're not trained to do that. Source can contain the full data set. The data set that goes to the statistician can be separately designated as a part of that source. So why not make the full data set visible and transparent to the clinically trained team at ClinOps, who really is responsible for reviewing the totality of that source and being able to identify all the deviations, all the safety concerns, making sure that everything is running correctly, and then take the subset of the data that really matters and giving it to the statistician, right? You don't need to have everybody involved with the data chain to have similar levels of training. You don't need that, right? Like I would envision maybe the CRA does initial review, complicated things, something very questionable, AE, serious adverse events, bring in the med monitor, right? That's why you have a medical monitor, right? Statistician, just get me the structured data for the endpoint analysis, right? But I know it's clean now. I know it's reliable. I know that it went through this very thorough review up front.
Yeah, I mean, that again makes perfect sense to me. And I do want to, we're getting down towards the end of the hour here. Besides the sponsor, obviously as sites, we can't say, here, integrate our eSource into your EDC. That's probably unlikely to happen. So aside from the sponsor, who can help, integrate that? And, why aren't we? Why don't we see more of it? I feel like it's not, I've seen almost no direct data options given to sites. Not that they necessarily should be, I guess, by the sponsor, depending on who you ask, but I just don't see that availability. And even if I use eSource, I'm still having to go double enter that data at this point.
Yeah. I mean, you have a whole set of practices built around secondary data entry, right? I mean, you have whole...
It's money. Groups. It's an industry.
You have whole processes, companies, departments, people, careers built around secondary EDC systems. EDC systems, certain features or mastery of those features is, your career currency. I mean, change is disruptive, change is threatening. I mean, what technology does is it streamlines things. What is streamlining? Removing jobs. I mean, that is streamline. That is efficiency, right? That's how you get efficiency. I mean, where else would the cost be in a clinical trial, right? It's all human effort. So if you want a better and smarter and faster way of doing things, it comes at the expense of, certain skill sets that have arisen in time. And sometimes it's hard to get all the players in the ecosystem to agree to that. So I think it's inevitable. I think it's coming, right? Like the logic is too compelling. And there aren't that many efficiencies left because everything else has gone direct data capture, right? The patient diary is all ePro, right? Labs is all LIMS systems, IRTs are all, like everything is digital, right? And now we're talking about, sending data to the homes, we're talking about wearables, talking about EMR, but where is the one pocket where we have those 3 review queues and on-site travel and variation and risk, like it's all in the site source, right? And what's in site source? The adverse events, the medications, the medical history, like really important stuff, right? And what are you getting with the site? You're getting the oversight of the PI, right? You're getting the PI's judgment, you're getting the safety protection, you're getting a lot of things that are really hard to deal with. So we need sites. They'll always be around. I think some people declare the death of sites too early. And at the end of the day, we need a site. It could be a virtual site, but it's still an independent PI with independent oversight, right? And maybe the delivery method is virtual instead of physical, but you still need independent PI oversight. And so that part of the workflow is the last mile.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I never really thought, well, I've thought about it, maybe not quite as directly as you stated it. I feel like that is odd that the site, who traditionally where all this stuff's happening, have sort of been the last to benefit from the way, like you said, all these other systems are all a little more, a little ahead. They've seemed like they've gotten a little more attention than just sort of the block and tackle that happens at site. So that's interesting observation. I've never really thought about it that way.
And Jonathan makes a really good point in the comment thread, right? Like data management really should think about less about, okay, I'm going to review form by form, field by field. Like that shouldn't be done right now in this day and age. It should be about the data science, should be about the aggregation of data, right? And there's a lot of data in the eSource that could inform not just the integrity of the clinical endpoint data, which obviously is the immediate need for the trial, but you can start to get data that might help you optimize clinical trial design in the future. For example, if you're a sponsor, you have no idea how long a visit takes, right? Like, how long is a patient on site? Is it 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours? There's nobody has a clue, right? But with Source, there's the timestamps, right? So I have an idea of how long it takes to do a visit, right? Do we want to run an analysis that says visits that take longer have higher dropout rates? We don't have the data to do that, right? So you can think about all the insights that could be uncovered by having access to that broader data set, right? And what you could do with that with data science. So I think part of the opportunity with technology is also sort of on the back end, right? Like things are moving to this data lake concept, right? Where everything goes into a data lake across studies, and you have CDASH to harmonize and normalize it. But you can take all of that data now and start to really mine it to inform protocol design, clinical site, trial site selection. There's all kinds of things you can do. You can run patterns to detect, fraud. That would be hard for an individual looking at it form by form, but if you can sort of scope out, right? So the powers in the data science and the AI and what you can do with large data sets, right? So Source is much more in line with that because it captures the data immediately, it sends it in, it's the full data set, it's got the audit trails, it's got attribution, it's got lots of other variables that as a sponsor you don't necessarily have access to today.
Yeah, no, there's certainly a lot of room left to run there. Yeah, I mean it's encouraging, right? Even though it's annoying in the short term, there's obviously still a lot of really cool stuff we could figure out as we start to put all these pieces together.
Yeah, AI robots completing the CRS from Source and probably.
Yeah, oh man, I saw that. Hey, you never know. You just never know at this point.
Yeah, I have one final thought. I got one final thought. Okay, so I know a lot of people are thinking, all right, first of all, so eSource to EDC APIs are hard. Okay, so we've done it before, but you don't want to go down that path. It's doable, but it's hard. But if people are thinking, okay, so like everyone has to use eSource to make this work, right? That's probably what people are thinking. But what if you had this idea that says, the most important thing is that we get the data, and the data has to be defined similarly, right? So we have this CDASH variable, right? So CDASH is CDASH. So is it conceivable? And this is a thought experiment. There's no way in shape or form ready for this, but it's a thought experiment. What if you had 3 different systems out there that capture data, and with CDASH, that the same data set, right? You think about real world data studies, you're using different EMR systems, right? They're different software systems. But now with interoperability and with standards, you now know that the data has the same meaning. So you can confidently scan across different EMR systems and draw conclusions, right? In theory, you should be doing the same thing with different systems, right? Even in the ePro world, I would argue if you have an Android app and an iOS app, right? they're probably, I'm not a software person, so they technically could be different software systems, right? They technically could be different databases, right? But they mean the same thing because you standardize and normalize the definition. So that is a very open possibility. It's not far-fetched, in my opinion, if you sort of change your thinking around what's really important, which is reliable, protocol-driven endpoint data.
No, I mean, again, it makes perfect sense to me, but not my world. But I can only pray we move slowly more in that direction. Raymond, dude, I appreciate you coming on. Awesome conversation. I had said before we started, I'm surprised you hadn't been on before, so I'm lucky, glad to have you on. I'll let you get back to scope, even though this is probably a lot more fun for sure. But all right, thanks, and thanks to everyone listening. We're doing this every week, so come back, and I just love having the conversation. So thanks so much, guys. Raymond, thanks again.
Thanks, Brad. Okay, bye-bye.
Later.